They were perfection incarnate, once. Warriors whose every motion was a hymn to beauty, whose every strike was a masterpiece of precision. The Emperor's children marched not merely for victory but for art. The art of war, the art of sound, the art of devotion. But perfection is a fragile thing. It decays when worshipped too long, fractures when reflected too closely in the mirror of pride. And when they looked upon that reflection, they saw not glory, but hunger, an infinite screaming hunger that would one day consume them whole. They said the Emperor's children could make war sound like music. Their bolters thundered in rhythm. Their blades struck in harmony, and even the death screams of their enemies seemed orchestrated, shaped by some divine conductor unseen. To witness them on the battlefield was to see beauty in its most terrible form, a vision so pure it could make the heart ache. The banners of the Third Legion shimmered in violet and gold, their armor polished until it reflected the suns of alien worlds. Every movement, every breath was a study in control. They did not merely fight, they performed. At their head walked Fulgrim the Phoenician, a figure so radiant that even other Primarchs found themselves pausing in his presence. His voice carried the cadence of command and poetry alike. His words could calm storms or ignite armies. To his sons, he was not just a commander. He was the ideal, the living sculpture of everything the Emperor had intended mankind to become. When he spoke of perfection, it was not mere ambition, it was religion. But beneath that brilliance, something else stirred. The Emperor's children had always sought flawlessness, yet perfection is an illusion that mocks those who chase it. Even in victory, they found themselves unsatisfied. A flawless campaign would end and silence would follow. Unbearable silence. Some among them began to hear that silence as a kind of accusation, a whisper that they could still do better, that beauty could yet be pushed beyond mortal understanding. It began as an ache, a hunger too faint to name. They polished their weapons more often, demanded more precise formations, more vivid banners, more glorious executions of the enemy. Their artificers crafted armor that glimmered like liquid amethyst. Their chaplains recited oaths that spoke less of duty and more of purity, not of the Emperor's will but their own. Perfection became a mirror they could not look away from. When Fulgrim strode through the ranks, his sons fell to one knee, overwhelmed not just by reverence but envy. To stand near him was to feel one's flaws laid bare, to see one's inadequacy reflected in divine form. Yet that pain too became intoxicating. They began to love it. The shame, the striving, the endless pursuit. In the Legion's eyes, to feel unworthy was proof of devotion. On the bridge of the pride of the Emperor, Fulgrim gazed upon a world being pacified below. The campaign was flawless as always. The orbital bombardment had fallen in perfect intervals, a pattern so mathematically precise it resembled music. But as he watched the fires bloom, a strange hollowness opened within him. He could not name it, but it gnawed. Perfection achieved, and yet nothing remained. No higher summit, no further glory. The realization felt like a wound. His chief lieutenants sensed it even if they dared not name it aloud. First Captain Eidolon watched his Primarch with a soldier's worship, yet something in him twisted with quiet resentment. Lucius, the swordsman whose blade work bordered on divine, felt it as rivalry, a silent challenge to prove himself worthy of his father's notice. And Fabius, the apothecary, saw in Fulgrim's perfection the proof that flesh itself could be improved upon. For each of them the same poison spread, the belief that beauty was never enough, that there must always be more. There was a moment, months later, when Fulgrim stood before a mirror of polished adamantium in his private sanctum. The war had ended. His armor was immaculate. His face, perfect, symmetrical, angelic, reflected the Emperor's design. Yet his eyes searched for something wrong, some flaw he could correct. He saw none, and that absence frightened him more than any enemy ever had. That was when he began to hear it. The faintest murmur, soft as breath. At first he thought it was memory or the echo of his own mind. But it persisted, threading through the silence like the beginning of a song. It spoke not in words but in feeling, curiosity, desire, invitation. Fulgrim, the Phoenician master of all things beautiful, did not recoil. Instead, he listened, because for the first time in a long while, he was not bored. And in that moment, though no one could see it, the first crack formed across the mirror. Fulgrim stood among the marble corridors of the pride of the Emperor, surrounded by statues of heroes long dead. The sculptures captured the perfection of form, chiseled expressions of loyalty, courage, triumph, yet none could match the subtle grace that lived within him. His legion had crafted them as tributes, yet every figure seemed lifeless now, mute and still. Fulgrim's gaze lingered on their frozen eyes, and he felt something like pity. Art once finished ceased to breathe. Perhaps that was why he could never stop creating, never stop perfecting. The Emperor had given him the gift of vision, but also the curse of dissatisfaction. He began to visit the Legion's galleries more often, wandering through corridors lined with paintings that captured their campaigns in exquisite detail. In those images, his warriors looked like angels of vengeance, immaculate and divine. Yet behind each canvas, beneath the varnish of triumph, he sensed decay, brushstrokes that felt too forced, too proud, as though the artists themselves feared the very idea of imperfection. He wondered then if beauty, pressed too tightly, began to rot. The murmuring voice returned to him in those long, silent halls. It whispered through the polished air, curling like smoke from an unseen source. At times it seemed to echo from within the marble itself, at others from behind his own thoughts. It spoke of purity beyond comprehension, of harmony so complete that pain and joy would merge into one. And though he dismissed it aloud, deep within his soul, Fulgrim began to crave that impossible promise. His sons noticed the change. The Phoenician smiled less, and when he did, his eyes no longer warmed. His commands grew sharper, his standards crueler. He demanded impossible precision. A gesture executed a second too late could draw his anger. A strike delivered a fraction off center could earn public humiliation. The Legion's perfection, once glorious, now carried the stench of fear. Lucius, the duelist, found that he could not stop practicing. He slept in the training halls, drenched in sweat and obsession. Each bout became a performance, not for victory but for admiration. When he fought, he could hear the crowd in his mind, cheering, gasping, worshipping. Even when no one watched, he felt their phantom applause echo through his veins. The seed of addiction had taken root. Fabius, meanwhile, pursued perfection of another kind. His laboratories became sanctuaries of experimentation, where servitors hummed over gene seed samples and dissected flesh. He believed that beauty was bound not to the spirit but to structure, that by improving the body one might ascend beyond mortality. When Fulgrim visited him once, he found a chamber filled with glass cylinders, each containing something that used to be human. Some still twitched faintly, alive but lost. Fabius bowed low and said, "Perfection requires sacrifice." Fulgrim said nothing, but when he looked into those tubes, he saw something disturbingly familiar. The reflection of his own ambition, taken to its logical end. The murmuring voice grew stronger each day, rising from whisper to melody. It came to him in dreams, soft, persuasive, seductive. Sometimes it sounded like the Emperor himself. Other times like a chorus of angels. It told him that the universe was not bound by the crude definitions of man, that the pursuit of perfection was divine rebellion. It told him that creation required destruction, that art and ruin were siblings. During one campaign upon a forgotten world of pale deserts, Fulgrim led his warriors against Xenos, whose architecture was composed entirely of crystal. The battle was short and one-sided, but Fulgrim could not destroy such beauty. He ordered his warriors to stop the bombardment. Instead, he walked through the alien halls, touching the crystalline walls, admiring the way the light fractured into colors he had never seen. The voice praised him, gentle and knowing. It said, "You understand now. Perfection is not obedience. It is freedom." Fulgrim's heart trembled at that word on freedom. It was both temptation and revelation. The Emperor had created them to be perfect instruments of his will. But what if the greatest perfection lay in surpassing the will that made them? When he returned to his fleet, his eyes gleamed with something new. Not devotion, but curiosity sharpened into hunger. He summoned his captains and spoke of transcendence, of art beyond reason, of feeling without restraint. Some nodded in reverence, others in fear. None yet understood that their father had already begun to drift from the Emperor's light. Far below the ship's decks, amid the barracks and the echoing clang of armorers, whispers spread like infection. The Emperor's children had always been vain, but now they seemed possessed. They repainted their armor with ever more elaborate filigree. They replaced functionality with ornament. Even in battle, they fought not merely to win, but to dazzle. A kill was not complete unless it was beautiful. The smell of promethium mixed with perfume. The scream of dying enemies was matched by laughter that sounded almost joyful. Their perfection had become performance, and performance demands an audience. They had begun to fight not for victory, nor even for the Emperor, but for the sound of their own magnificence echoing back at them. The mirror had cracked. Now it began to bleed. The pride of the Emperor sailed through the void like a jeweled dagger. Its hull shimmered with gold-trimmed sigils, its corridors echoing with choral hymns that no longer praised the Emperor alone. The ship had become a gallery, a cathedral, a stage, a world unto itself where sound and light intertwined in obsessive balance. Warriors rehearsed their battle formations like dancers refining choreography. The clang of ceramite boots on metal decks was no longer the march of soldiers, but the rhythm of ritual. Fulgrim watched them from his command dais, surrounded by walls of marble and silk, each surface sculpted to reflect beauty from every angle. But beauty, he had begun to realize, was not constant. It was alive, shifting, demanding. He looked upon his sons and saw both their glory and their stagnation. Even perfection could grow dull with repetition. The murmur within him, that melody he could no longer silence, promised evolution. Change, it whispered. To perfect something, one must break it first. The transformation began subtly. Orders grew stranger, more indulgent. Fulgrim commanded that their war songs be rewritten, no longer as hymns of loyalty but as expressions of feeling. Pain, triumph, lust, despair. Every emotion became sacred. The warriors sang as they fought, their voices blending with the roar of bolters until the line between battle and art blurred completely. When a campaign brought them to a forgotten forge world, Fulgrim decreed that victory alone was insufficient. "We shall remake this world," he said, "in the image of what it could be, not what it was." Factories became opera halls, Manufactorums became theaters of war, and every dying scream was preserved in crystalline memory cores as part of a new symphony of conquest. The planet's surface, once blackened with soot, glittered under the light of burning forges, a monument to excess disguised as triumph. Eidolon watched with awe and unease. The discipline that had once defined them was dissolving. His Primarch's perfection now felt alien, his beauty terrifying. Lucius, however, was enthralled. He had begun carving new symbols into his armor, marking every duel won, every opponent slain, every scar earned. He fought not for command, but for the ecstasy of mastery, and the screams of the dying became his orchestra. In the Apothecarian, Fabius refined his experiments. Gene seed was no longer sacred. It was clay. He spliced, grafted, and shaped the flesh of the fallen into grotesque mosaics of human form. He whispered to himself that he served Fulgrim's vision, that through this corruption lay a greater truth. But even he began to suspect that what they followed was no longer vision, but infection. The first to voice doubt was a captain named Solomon Demeter. He had fought beside Fulgrim since the earliest campaigns, loyal to the core, but he saw what others refused to see, that the Legion's obsession had become disease. He approached his Primarch in the Great Hall, kneeling but unafraid. "My lord," he said, his voice trembling only slightly, "we seek perfection, yet I fear we lose ourselves in the search." Fulgrim looked down at him, his expression unreadable. Around them, statues of marble and gold towered like silent witnesses. For a long time there was only silence. Then Fulgrim smiled, and not cruelly but gently, almost lovingly. "You mistake surrender for loss, Solomon. To perfect oneself is to surrender to what one truly is." Solomon tried to protest, but Fulgrim's gaze pierced through him, radiant and terrible. "You see chains where there are none," the Primarch continued. "We are artists, not slaves. The Emperor's design was the beginning, not the end. Would you deny humanity its potential simply because you fear what it might become?" Solomon bowed his head, crushed not by anger but by despair. He had seen something in his father's eyes, a light that was no longer human. When he left that hall, he knew the Emperor's children were lost. That night, the pride of the Emperor drifted in orbit above the dead world, its decks illuminated by shifting violet light. Fulgrim stood before the vast viewport, the stars reflected in his silver eyes. The whisper within him no longer felt external. It was part of his own thoughts now, seamless, intimate. He spoke aloud to the empty air. "What is perfection if not the courage to transcend?" The voice replied from within him, soft and sweet. "Then transcend, my beloved. The path awaits." In the reflection on the glass, Fulgrim thought he saw movement, a shimmer, like a figure behind him. But when he turned, there was only the faint scent of incense and the sound of distant music. He smiled. The mirror had shattered long ago. Now at last he was free to step through it. The first time Fulgrim held the layer blade, he felt it hum as though alive. It was no ordinary weapon. The craftsmanship was impossible, beyond even the skill of the finest artisans of the Imperium. Its edge shimmered in impossible colors, reflecting not light but desire itself. When he drew it, the air seemed to thrum in resonance with his heartbeat. The blade sang faintly at first, then with clarity, a melody that tugged at the edges of his soul. He had been warned by whispers in the ship's corridors, by subtle glances from those who knew, that certain relics were better left untouched. Yet Fulgrim's curiosity was inexhaustible, and curiosity, he believed, was a cornerstone of perfection. He walked the blade through his hands, feeling its balance, the micro vibrations that resonated along the haft. It was not merely a weapon, it was a key, a teacher, a seducer. When he held it, he thought he could feel every imperfection in the universe, every flaw in flesh, spirit, and form. And then it spoke. Or perhaps he imagined it spoke. Words not audible, yet piercingly clear. I can show you what lies beyond, if you are willing. Fulgrim smiled, though no one else was present to see it. Willingness was never the problem. He had long learned that perfection required sacrifice and the finest art demanded obsession. He cradled the blade, sensing the potential it offered. The promise that beauty could be sharpened beyond the boundaries of mortality. In that moment, the Phoenician recognized that this was no mere temptation. This was an invitation to ascend, to touch the divine not through obedience, but through mastery over all forms of life and sensation. When he revealed the blade to his captains, their reactions were predictably reverent. Some trembled before its elegance, unable to comprehend the subtle resonance that made the air vibrate. Lucius, ever sensitive to artistry and combat, drew closer than the others, his eyes glinting with excitement. Fabius examined the weapon with scientific fascination, noting the almost imperceptible undulations along the metal that seemed to defy any known alloy. Yet it was Fulgrim's presence that animated the blade. It responded to him alone, quivering with latent promise as though it had been waiting for his hands all along. The layer blade became an obsession. It was more than a tool. It was a mirror of Fulgrim's own ambition. The Legion watched as he practiced with it endlessly, his form flawless, his motions almost hypnotic in their grace. With every strike he explored the boundaries of sensation, discovering nuance in speed, precision, and rhythm that he had never known. It was artistry made living, an expression of both war and beauty. And yet with every sweep, every perfected thrust, a subtle corruption threaded itself through the Legion. The warriors began to sense the blade's influence in the Primarch himself. The perfection they had worshipped became unsettling, almost alien. They saw Fulgrim laugh less in camaraderie, smile only at the reflection of the blade's edge. The aura around him shifted from inspiration to intoxication. The pursuit of excellence became inseparable from desire. Not merely the desire to excel, but the desire to be touched by something higher, something ineffably intoxicating. By the time the campaign on the Crystal World ended, whispers had begun among the Emperor's children. Some spoke in reverence, calling the blade the gift of insight. Others, more cautious, murmured that it was cursed, that the blade's beauty was a trap. Yet none could deny its power. Fulgrim wielded it with a grace that seemed impossible. Each movement a study in elegance, each swing a promise of transcendence. Even Fulgrim himself felt the subtle shift. It was not sudden, not violent, rather a gentle, insidious expansion of awareness. He began to perceive the limitations of flesh, the constraints of emotion, the inadequacy of loyalty. The Legion, magnificent as it was, seemed insufficient. There was a higher plane, a realm of sensation, of perfection unbound by law or morality. And the blade whispered that he could reach it. And in that whisper, temptation blossomed like a dark flower.